So 2 use cases that we're going to talk about. And before diving into the use cases, let's look at the personas, and they will actually show up as actors later as well in the token design. So we kind of threw them around a little bit, but let's name 4 of them. So the SMB, small medium business, in our example from earlier, that's Tire Inc. We assume they're running something like QuickBooks or Datev or Xero or some kind of online accounting system. They're a smaller business. They have maybe thousands to millions of dollars, euros of revenue. And they actually might not even run a Centrifuge node themselves. They might run something like a hosted node, like an Infura type Centrifuge node. Then we have another user, which is a large corporate. So I mentioned BASF earlier. They run SAP, like billions of revenue. They have their own IT department. They have different kind of requirements in terms of volume or managing the identity differently than an SMB might want to do. We have something we call existing business networks or service providers. So there are businesses out there today who provide integrations, right? So SAP is a whole universe in itself. They're SAP integrators. So one of our partners is actually building an SAP add-on for Centrifuge. So you can plug Centrifuge into SAP really easily. Or there are networks, closed networks that do electronic invoicing. So what we saw earlier about sending invoice around can be very centralized. And we're actually working with some of these together to offer new financial applications to the existing users. That's another user or persona. And then, of course, the funder, which is important here, is a capital provider. Capital provider could be a bank, a hedge fund, a private person. It could also be a decentralized funding application living on Ethereum, for example, for invoice financing. And some of these are not mutually exclusive. Actually, we have large corporates who want to provide the funding to fund their suppliers. So keeping that in mind. But those are kind of the 4 big buckets when we think about the users or personas within Centrifuge. So let's dive a little bit deeper into invoice financing. And we talked about that already, but I'm just going to walk you through. So same as before, these 2 exchange an invoice. And then at some point, Tire Inc. mints this unpaid invoice NFT. So they can do a couple of things with that. One is they can actually get traditional funding. So when we said earlier about underwriting, like your question, like how do you do that? They can give access to the funder, and they can basically trade this invoice NFT to signal ownership of this unpaid invoice or this payment obligation. It can be a bank, it can be an accredited investor of any kind to kind of take this on. But what's awesome about Ethereum, there are other projects in the DeFi world. So there are projects who can take this collateral and then give financing for that. So unfortunately, there are not that many yet who can actually do ERC 721s, but we're working with a couple of them as they're introducing new forms of financing. So example, Maker, multi-collateral DAI should support all kinds of assets. And there are other like lending platforms who we can go and integrate with. And the flow is then, of course, they get the money. At some point, these folks pay, they get paid back. Ta-da. I think we already kind of talked through all of that with your questions from earlier. But this is how the NFTs really play in there. Why is this interesting for the traditional funders? They get more and new assets. New assets also, when we say providing economic opportunity everywhere, like people who previously might not have had access to financing can join Centrifuge and find a funder who is willing to underwrite them without a lot of paper. And funding can happen in fiat or crypto. Doesn't really matter from that. Decentralized financing, there actually the funding happens in crypto, which is a very different beast. And data availability and so on is where the token comes in later. So let's talk about something we haven't really talked about, and that's deep tier finance. So I mentioned earlier with the first version, basically there's an invoice that gets exchanged or between 2 parties. Great. But what we really going for is what we call the business graph. And you can think about it a little bit in terms of messages being passed around, like Raiden or Lightning Network, right? Where multiple nodes pass messages around until it finds an endpoint that is able to, that they want to get to. We have provable relationships, so you can prove invoice volume over time, you can prove just they have done business, there was an order received, and so on. And you can also start to prove really balances that exist. And when I say you can prove, it's not an outside entity improving everything, but between each of these nodes, all of this history exists. And they can start kind of figuring out where to route a funding request to. And how that, like an example from the footwear industry, is if you have somebody like a shoe folks or apparel folks to produce shoes, they need to order shoelaces, who need to order fabric, who need to order cotton from somewhere. So you have these supply chains that are multiple layers deep, and you can do that for footwear and apparel. We're also working on some more sustainability focused ones where there's a tea grower that goes to a distributor, it ends up in stores at a later point. And so the question here is, how can these folks basically get access to financing to grow their business or maintain their business with the credit risk of these folks? And today that's just completely impossible to prove these relationships around. And that's what we're working on when we talk about the business graph, to kind of pass these messages around. And there also, this is unlikely to work without an incentive for each of the involved parties to pass these messages along. So when we talk about decentralized features, so that's something really where token and a token economy plays a big role. That's deep tier financing. Yeah, I mentioned that already. I just talked about all of that already. We're talking about invoices, but you can finance purchase orders, warehouse receipts, again, all these kind of things. Cool. Those are the use cases, deep tier financing. Yes?
Which supply chains have the biggest problem and thus use of your deep tier financing solution?
Yeah. We get asked this a lot, like, which supply chain should you tackle first? We did some analysis, but for us, actually, the best supply chain is the first one that actually works with us. So we're not going out and can talk to 100 large buying organizations or large supply chains. So we have a couple of projects that I mentioned, like the tea growing example is actually an example where we know there's a project who want to fund the tea growers at the very bottom of it, and there are multiple layers involved. So that's something where we collaborate with them. Yeah, it's less about us to go really broad, but really finding the first ones to work with us today, and then go from there. Yeah.
For the integration of the NFT representations with the rest of, for example, decentralized finance, you mentioned, for example, like multi-collateral DAI. One of the things with DAI is I know for the tokens, they tend to have like different risk parameters for like all the different tokens, and like all these parameters being evaluated constantly to make sure like it stays stable. How would it, like, if you talk with them about that, like how would it work for NFTs, which are like all different? How would they like manage the risk with that?
Yeah. Without giving away too much of like how the actual integration works, it's basically if you have an ERC20, you can get a price feed. What's the price of whatever, an ocean token, which I actually don't know how the token is actually called. I think it's ocean token. Yes. So you get a price feed, and that's how they do that with like how much over collateralization you should have and so on. For NFTs, you have to have a price feed per document basically. In the invoice case, you have to also calculate the risk, right? If Philip sends an invoice to Cassidy, that's different than if Evonik sends an invoice to BASF. And so when you start allowing, what kind of assets do you allow? These risk parameters are not only the price and the price feed, but also the characteristics of the documents themselves. So you'll have to get much, much more fine-grained to kind of allow these things in. And what we can do with the NFTs, how they're minted for us, is that you can actually, when you mint this, you have to provide these proofs. This is me, this is Cassidy, and and then based on these parameters, they can be allowed into something like Maker or any other DeFi product.
The financing of an invoice, right? Is it working like on an auction type of system? Because then I could imagine I could come up with some civils that collude, basically, so tire and car collude and produce a business graph. So in order to keep the risk score low, and then actually just grab the money from this financing partner, right? How is this? Is this all about Ethereum names then, or the ID system? That's basically like a border, like a permission system then. So,
I think
yeah.
So we have different funders who work with these assets. Some of them are actually marketplaces, so to say, who like receive an invoice and then they auction that off to a funder who's willing to meet the funding request. But that's what I meant earlier, but it's not trustless, right? So they still do underwriting and really looking, oh, this is really you. And how it works today is that if I want to get financing, I provide to my funder, this is my Centrifuge ID, like off band, so to say. I'm saying, here, my Centrifuge ID is 1. And then you can see, oh, this is really the invoice that belongs to 1. And then you kind of go from there. Yeah. But definitely, there is the possibility for these Sybil attacks, especially when we talk DeFi, when we say, okay, what assets should be allowed into a loan or and so on. There you will also, you could say you can start coming up with whatever rules you want, how long these IDs have been existing, how much volume they had over the years, and so on and so forth. And then even with DeFi, there's still a risk. That's why you pay a percentage for financing so that the risk can be covered of something defaulting potentially. Yeah.
You said if someone asks in the system, you can uncover some different fields of a document. How do you exactly do that?
How do what?
How do you uncover fields to someone that's asking for some field in a document that was signed?
Practically how that works is, so again, we have this wonderful Merkle tree, right? So each of the values, I've actually thought about putting a slide in there how that works, but each of the leaves is one of the fields of an invoice. And so I sent this invoice to Cassidy, we both signed it, there was a root hash that's committed to Ethereum. If you come later and say, hey, Philip, reveal to me the line item description of item number 5. I basically find that leaf, this line item description number 5, and I create a Merkle proof and give you just the line item description, give it to you, and you can validate that Merkle proof against what we, a year ago, whenever, agreed on and anchored on Ethereum. Does it make sense? If not, I can draw it out for you afterwards.
No, I'm just wondering the context of a contract. How does someone know what the specific wording and what was in that contract?
The data structure.
Yeah. Good. Yes. Yeah. The data structure. So the data structure is well known. So what an invoice is a well-known data structure within the network. Or what a purchase order is a well-known data structure. Of course, if you have a text field and you just type whatever you want in there, then you cannot create a proof. You can create a proof about this one text field, but not about the content. So all of the documents that are floating around in Centrifuge are agreed upon data structures where everybody can validate, this is the invoice, these are the fields. There's a way how this Merkle tree gets generated that's always, it's a deterministic way how you can generate these proofs and so on. Does it answer your question?
So the contract formats are agreed upon in general by the network? Invoice.
Yeah, the documents that are floating around, yeah. And that's also then, right, so because everybody agrees what an invoice of a certain, there's versioning of the documents, blah, 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 but then you can basically start requesting, give me a sum of all the invoices that you have outstanding with somebody else and so on.
Question, this graph, where does it live actually?
So Cassidy will talk about that a little bit later, how the graph actually works together.
Yeah, you said you worked already with some actual companies.
Mm-hmm.
Given your current MVP stage, what type of value do these companies see in your current solution? Like, what are the features that they really look at or look forward to?
Mm-hmm. So I think you might also touch on that, but basically there's two things. One is the single source of truth. So in the BASF case, actually, that's one thing that they really want to rely on, that single source of truth, because they have many suppliers and many different parties looking at this invoice. So it's unalterable. You know it's that. In all of their accounting systems and whatever, they can kind of come back to that. So that's one thing. And then the other thing is really the tokenization and getting financing. And that's how we come at it as well. I mean, that's kind of maybe the self-fulfilling prophecy, because that's the approach that we take. And some projects actually, I'm thinking there's one project who are minting NFTs on behalf of their users and then doing crowdfunding on these NFTs. So like crowdfunded invoice funding, so to say. But also there it's a tokenization that they rely on.